What's up, folks? How's it going? This is Waj. Hope you guys are all doing well. Now, with the latest release of the 2020 version of the MacBook Air, which Apple essentially addressed the major complaints that we found on the previous generation Retina MacBook Air, which was the fact that the keyboard sucked and the processor was very slow. Now we have the option to upgrade the internal processor as well as add in more storage up to 2 terabytes, and we have an improved keyboard that utilizes a more traditional scissor style mechanism, unlike the butterfly low profile mechanism that we found on the previous generation Air, as well as the current generation 13-inch version of the MacBook Pro. And this brings us to the main topic at hand, which is the notion that I think the MacBook Air in its current version with the upgraded internal specifications and better keyboard is actually a more compelling laptop than the 13-inch version of the MacBook Pro, which got a hardware refresh last year in 2019. Now we're going to be taking a look at the baseline version of the 13-inch MacBook Pro from 2019, which came with a Intel Core i5 processor, 8 gigabytes of RAM, and 128 gigabytes of SSD storage. Retails for around $1,299, and the new MacBook Air actually retails for around $1,000, which is actually $100 cheaper than the initial launch price of this new generation Retina Air, which is nice to see. But we actually have the optional upgrade Intel Core i7 version of the base model, which comes to around $1,250. Specifically on the Pro, we're using the i5-8257U processor. That's a 4-core, 8-thread chip that can turbo up to 3.9 gigahertz. The upgraded MacBook Air processor is an Intel i7-10650NG7 that also has 4 cores, 8 threads, but can turbo up to 3.8 gigahertz. So very similar in terms of most parameters from a core, thread, and frequency standpoint. And we have the exact same parameters in terms of 8 gigabytes of RAM and 128 gigabytes of long-term SSD storage on the Air as well. Now, taking a look at the CPU benchmark results on Cinebench R15, the MacBook Pro got around 680 points versus you're looking at about 435 points on the MacBook Air. And if we take a look at the Geekbench performance results, we're getting a faster single-core performance at around 1,200 points on the Air versus about 900 points on the Pro, but faster multi-core performance on the Pro at around 3,200 points versus 2,800 points on the Air. Furthermore, in terms of the graphical capabilities, both are using Intel Iris integrated graphics. And if we take a look at our Unigine Valley benchmark at 720p with high details, we're getting a higher average frames per second on the MacBook Air at around 29.7 average frames per second versus around 24.1 average frames per second on the MacBook Pro. Now, in terms of the display quality, both of these two machines are pretty much identical. They're using more or less the same display. Exact same parameters in terms of screen size, 13.3 inch. The resolution at the native level is the same, 2560 by 1600, and the same PPI count, about 227. Both are IPS LED backlit displays and are excellent in terms of all viewing angles and provide great sense of clarity and are fairly bright as well. Now, beyond those notions, you're also fairly similar in terms of ports and connectivity options on the baseline versions. If you get the MacBook Pro baseline version, you have basically 2 Thunderbolt 3 connections, the same as the MacBook Pro, as well as a 3.5 millimeter headphone jack. You can upgrade to having an additional 2 other ports on the other side if you so desire, but you're still limited to USB-C and Thunderbolt 3. So if you want to get USB Type-A or SD card reader, you're going to have to deal with adapters, but that's pretty much the same thing with a lot of modern day laptops these days. Speaker configurations and things like that are very similar as well. Both have 720p front-facing FaceTime cameras as well. Now, possibly one of the biggest advantages to getting the Air versus the 13-inch Pro has to be the new generation keyboard. As we mentioned before, they've ditched the ultra-low profile butterfly mechanism that we found on the MacBook Pro that's currently available right now, and only really the MacBook Air and the 16-inch version of the MacBook Pro has this new generation keyboard that uses a more traditional scissor mechanism, has greater key travel, nice key spacing, and streamlined layout and gives nice feedback as well to when you're typing, very comfortable to type with for prolonged periods of time. The only real advantage that the MacBook Pro has over the Air is the fact that you have the light bar at the top of the keyboard, something that we're never going to see on the Air for the time being. But besides that minor notion, from a pure typing experience, the MacBook Air is definitely superior from a keyboard standpoint, and the trackpad on both devices are pretty much identical. Great overall feedback and no complaints that I've had thus far. Now, until we get a new version of the MacBook Air that features the same keyboard as found on the Air definitely has a big advantage over here. And at the moment, the only real other MacBook that has this keyboard is the 16-inch version of the Pro, which comes at a completely different price point. And this is what makes the Air for the time being a very compelling option. Now, lastly, I want to talk about the one thing that the MacBook Pro 13-inch version has over the MacBook Air, and that is, ironically, battery life. It has a larger battery capacity, 58.2 watt hour versus 49.9 watt hour on the 13-inch Air. And according to Apple, the MacBook Pro is rated for around 10 hours of wireless web or video playback, and you're looking at around 11 hours of wireless web and about 12 hours of video playback on the Air. Now, based on our specific testing, which we like to do, which is a video playback test in airplane mode, 50% brightness, we actually get a much better score and runtime on the MacBook Pro. Got a total runtime of 9 hours and 19 minutes versus around 8 hours and 4 minutes on the Air. Now, the Air that we have over here is fairly new. We've only had around a dozen discharge cycles, so that might factor into the performance result, but that's still a huge discrepancy, about an hour's difference. And in most cases, I did experience that I got better overall battery performance out of the MacBook Pro in the current generation because it has that larger battery capacity and fairly similar internal specifications. It would make sense that you're getting a little bit better juice out of the Pro compared to the Air for the time being, which is kind of funny because the old generation of the MacBook Air was battery monster. Usually get around 12 hours plus on every charge cycle, which is not typically the case on the new generation of the MacBook Air, but still fairly good nonetheless, and it beats out most Windows PCs in this category. Definitely love to hear your thoughts on what you guys think is the best laptop from Apple right now from a budgetary standpoint, from a non-budgetary standpoint. Would you get the Air in its current version right now over the MacBook Pro? Definitely love to hear your thoughts. Also, check out our video where we compare the new generation MacBook Air versus the current generation of the iPad Pro. You'll find that video by clicking on the card or in the description down below. Big thank you for you guys for all your support. Please give us a thumbs up. Make sure you have post notifications turned on and subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you real soon in the next one.